Welcome back again. In this lesson, we will be talking about supplementary views in collection views. And those are essentially a kind of view that you can reuse them as many times as you want. And we often use them for situations such as a header view for sections or a footer view for sections. So let's go ahead and see how we do that. I'm going to head into Xcode. And here I'm going to start a new application called Supplementary Views in collection views. So once I have that, I'm going to head into my view controller. And because I know what I have to do, I'm going to do some parts of it right away. I'm not going to necessarily do it in the right order. But I know for a fact that we have to be doing UI collection view delegate. And we have to be doing UI collection view data source. So I know that part. And I know I have to essentially make an outlet for my collection view. So I'm going to say my collection view of the type UI collection view. And we have to include two methods for sure. So number of items in section. Let's say return 0 for now. And cell for item at index path. So these two, they absolutely must be there. So I'm going to say let cell to be collection view dot dequeue using the identifier that we always use for an index path, which is the index path. So I have the basics of making a collection view. Now let's head into our storyboard, and I have to return this, of course, return cell. So let's head into our storyboard, and in here what I'm going to have is I'm going to have an actual collection view. So here is a collection view. I'm going to place it about here. Not like that, like that. And then in my collection view, I'm going to go ahead and change the name of my cell. So this guy here, I'm going to call it cell ID, something like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and connect it to the outlet that we made. So my collection view is this one. And then I'm going to go in here and add something that is called a reusable view, which is essentially, let me search for it, which is this one. And this is essentially a view that we can add to our collection views, and it acts as a reusable UI view that you can reuse it for different sections or for different purposes. So let's add one here as a footer and add one here as the header. Now for both of these, since they are reusable, just like when we had a cell and our cell has an ID, I'm going to give them IDs as well. So this is header ID. And then this bottom one is footer ID. So we have the two of these. And because I want to have some content in them, I'm going to have to actually give them a subclass as well. So to do that, I'm going to say Command N. And in a Cocoa Touch class, I'm going to say these are actually of the type UI collection reusable view. And one of them is going to be called a header view. So that's that. I'm going to say Command N again. And again of the type UI collection reusable view, this one is going to be called a footer view. As you can imagine, we need the views, so we will be able to get access to the content within these two reusable views. So the top one, the class for it becomes, let me zoom into here, becomes header view. And the bottom one, the class for it becomes obviously the footer view. So now that we have this, we can have any kind of content within them as if they were just UI views. So for instance, I could go in here and say, this one has a label inside it, maybe like that. And this other one has the same thing. I'm going to work with labels because they're the easiest objects, but you can imagine you could essentially use any kind of object in them. And then I'm going to go to my assistant window. In the assistant window, I'm going to load the right file, which one of them would be the header view. Once the header view is loaded, I'm going to go in here and say, this is a header label. and that's one of them. And now let's load the footer view, and that is also properly connected to my footer view outlet here. So I'm going to connect that, and that becomes footer label. So now we have everything that we need. We have a table view. For our table view, we have a cell, obviously. We have a supplementary header view and a supplementary footer view. We now have to head into our coding and write the code that is going to reuse these reusable views and show us different content depending on the sections. And to do that, I'm going to go to my view controller. And I'm going to make an assumption right off the bat that my collection view actually has two sections. One section that we have been doing for a while for cities, another section for countries. So I'm going to go ahead in here and say let cities array to be these guys. Let's say New York, let's say Vancouver, and let's say New Delhi. And let's say I have the last one to be Rio. And then I have let countries array to be, and again here I have US, I have Canada, I have India, and maybe I have Mexico. So we got some cities and some countries, and we want to have two sections. To do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and say variable array of arrays, and that's going to be an array that is an array of arrays of strings. So this is a bit of a complicated process. I'm saying an array of arrays, which is an array which within it there are arrays of strings. So I'm going to put these two arrays within this array, and I'm going to do that in my view did load. So right off the top in here at the very beginning, I'm going to say in my view did load, array of arrays becomes an array of cities array and countries array. So now we have the array that we need to show in this collection view. Then I'm going to go in here to my number of items in sections, and before that actually I have to decide about the number of sections. So I'm going to say number of sections, and the number of sections would be the number of objects in this array. So I'm going to say return this one dot count. So we got the number of sections taken care of. Then we have to worry about the number of items in each of these sections. So for that, I'm going to say array of arrays, section, whether it is the zeroed one or the first one. From that, what I want to get is the count of it. So if we are in the first one, get the cities array count. If we are in the countries array, get the countries array count. Finally, we have the cell for item at index path, and we already have a cell, so that's good. Let's format this properly. And in here, I'm going to say let cell label to be a UI label made by a frame. And the frame for it is actually cell.boundaries. So wherever my cell is, place this guy right over there. And then cell label dot text alignment. I'm going to say ns text alignment dot center. So they are taken care of. Cell label dot font, let's make it a UI font dot system font of size, maybe a larger one such as 22. And then the important thing of it is cell label dot text, which essentially has to become array of arrays. From the array of arrays, we have to get the index path dot section. So we find from which array we want to read, and then from there we want to get index path dot row. So we want to find which section and from which section which row you want to read for this particular text. Once we have that, I'm going to go ahead and say cell dot background view becomes cell label. This is a different way that we have been doing. In the past, we have actually been adding the cell label to our cells, which is good for testing, but generally not a very good idea. But here I'm actually adding it as a background view. In general, is not a good idea to build your items here when you are doing, when you are producing your cells for items. It's better if you subclass your cell, but I don't want to do that because I don't want to make things overly complicated. This isn't the topic of this particular lesson. And then finally, maybe we change the background colors as well. So I'm going to say cell.background color becomes UI color dot red. And like always, if indexPath.row was modulus 2 was 0, the even ones essentially, make the cell dot background color to become UI color dot blue. So we have two sets of cells. We have the blue ones and the red ones, and they all show the correct label, hopefully. The final thing I have to do before I run the application, I have to make sure that my collection view dot delegate is self, and also my collection view dot data source is self. You could do this either in your storyboard or do it here in your actual coding environment. Now, if I run the application now, we should be able to see a collection view with two sets of data, some of them being cities, some of them being countries, and the two header views are there, but we just can't see anything. And since we didn't set any of the constraints, we're getting this weird look that, there's some gaps in here. But that's, again, doesn't matter for this particular practice. The next thing that is important is actually setting our values for these gaps on the top and the bottom. Those are our two views, the header view and the footer view. And to do that, we use a particular function from the delegation called view for supplementary view. And that's the kind of function that returns what view you would like to see at what supplementary location. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say let, and I'm going to call this one my sub view, which is of the type UI collection reusable view. So we have that. And then somewhere much further, let me get only this code in here. Somewhere at the end, we have to return my sub view. But in the between these two, we have to essentially decide what happens to the sub view. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say if this thing if kind was of the type UI collection view dot header, element is header. So for the header, we have to do something. In the else, which is the footer, we have to obviously do something else. So in header, I'm going to go ahead and say let header to become collection view, and I'm going to dequeue a supplementary view for it. And this is a bit of a long code, so I'm actually going to format it like this, which is a different way of formatting the moment you take it outside the parentheses. So I'm going to say the ID that I want to dequeue is this one. The ID is actually header ID, just like what we did before. The index path is obviously index path, and the kind of the object that we want to use is actually this kind, UI collection view element section header, just like what we had earlier. So now we have the header, but the header is not of the type that we want, which is the header view. So I'm going to have to fix that one. So I'm going to say get this as a header view. So we have that part taken care of. And now I could go ahead and say header dot header label dot text, say whatever that we want. This is header. And of course you make it relevant to the value of your index path. If the index path is section is 0, you make it say something. If it is not, you make it say something else. I'm actually going to try to do that for you in the footer section. However, once that is done, I'm going to have to go ahead and say in here, my subview becomes header. So now we have our subview, which is of the type that we need it to be. And then we're going to go ahead and here and say, of course, return that. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing here for the else part, which is the footer. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste the whole thing in here, say let footer to be dequeue reusable, all of that is good, section type, which is footer. So we are in the footer. If you were there, don't get the header ID, rather get the footer ID, and don't get it as a header view, get it as a footer view. And obviously it doesn't have a header label anymore. It has a footer label, if I'm not wrong. Is that what we called it? Let's have a look. Footer label has a footer. Yes. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say, let's just rewrite this whole thing with an if statement. So I'm going to say, once we got the footer, if indexmat.section is 0, if we're in the very first one, say footer dot footer label dot text says section 0. All right, and otherwise you just say something else. You do footer label, footer text label becomes section 1. You obviously could decide, or you should decide on much better ways of doing these things. I'm just doing it for the purpose of demonstration. So once again, we have view for supplementary element of kind. If the supplementary element of kind is header, we subclass our header view. Otherwise, we do our footer view. No matter what, we return that subview at the end, depending on whether that subview becomes a footer or it becomes a header. And for either of the two of them, we essentially write the kind of data that we want. In this case, we only have a text value. Otherwise, you would have more value. And if I run my application now, we should be able to see a new header view and a new footer view for our collection views. That it says this is header for both of them. This is section 0 footer. This is section 1 footer. I'm going to quickly change some of the look matters of my collection view because it looks really ugly and I don't want that. The first thing I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to come to my view did load. I'm going to say, let's get the layout. Let's call it my layout to be self.myCollectionView.collectionView layout as, I'm going to get it as UI collection view flow layout. And then I'm going to go ahead and say my layout dot section inset becomes UI edge insets of the values that I want to put in here is I want to give it some space for the top and bottom. So the top, I'm going to give it 50, left is 0, bottom I'm going to give it 50, and right is 0 again. So I want to have a little larger space for both my footer view and my header view. And then I'm going to head into my storyboard, and here I'm going to select my collection view and set all the constraints for it, maybe 30, 0, 0, and 30. The same numbers are good. So it actually has some gap on the top, some gap on the bottom. And if we run our application now, we should be able to see that the collection view is properly constraining itself, and we see the header view and the footer view. And we obviously can essentially reuse this if you had more sections in your collection view. And that is essentially how we use a supplementary view in collection views. We use it primarily with this method, view supplementary element of kind. But to do that, we need to have our header views or footer views or any other kind of reusable view that we want. And that's about that. Let's keep it up to here and let's move on to our next lesson.